Are we setting healthy limits with the people in our lives? Have we said yes to too much and need to start coming back with some no's? Are we present enough in our days that we can give our whole selves to those people in front of us, or are we running around like a mad chook with our head cut off? Because that's what I have been most of the time, and I'm really trying to come back from that. So I would love to start our leadership conversation today by reiterating the title that I sent to you in the email. So the title for today is Leaning into Your Limits. Leaning into your limits. Everyone loves limits, don't they? No. So this actual title, Leaning into Your Limits, is from that book I mentioned last week, The Emotionally Healthy Leader by Peter Scazzero. Last week, I brought you a section of that book, which I called The Secret to Success. And I defined the secret to success, once again, coming from that book, as doing the will of God. Quite a countercultural statement that success is doing the will of God, not the other countercultural measures that we generally use. So this is also from that book, the same chapter even, this idea of leaning into our limits as something that really honors God as we seek to do the will of God. So what is a limit? Well, we're trying to be countercultural, right? So first of all, we have to look at how the world would look at a limit that's been placed on you, your ministry, your life. And I would say that in the worldly sense, when somebody has a limit placed on them, we would see it as being something that needs to be fought and overcome. And there are so many movies and books about people overcoming their limits, right? It's something that we really honor. And there are certainly a time and a place to celebrate and to go after the overcoming of a limit. But in terms of being countercultural, there's another way to look at our limits. And Peter Scazzero, he says that we need to see our limits as a gift from God to lean into in order to see his will done. He argues that we can be more successful leaning into our limits than fighting against them. And there are some biblical examples that he brings out to back this up. So the first one he goes for is quite obvious, that in the Garden of Eden, God gave man and woman everything, but he did place some significant limits on them. And in particular, it was the tree. He said, do not eat of the tree of knowledge. It was a limit. And Adam and Eve, perhaps in a worldly sense, wanted to overcome this limit and eat of the fruit anyway. And it didn't necessarily go well, because sometimes limits are God-given for a God-given purpose. Last week, we talked about some of the limits that were placed on the ministry of John the Baptist, the most successful ministry that had ever been seen, in the words of Jesus. He attracted great crowds, but he understood his role as being the forerunner of Jesus. And so when Jesus came along and John was put in prison, it wasn't really something that needed to be seen to be overcome. John didn't need to overcome the limit of him being placed in prison. That limit was a God-given limit to then allow Jesus's ministry to come to fruition. And that in itself can be a difficult thing to really listen to and take in. In Jesus's ministry, he really did lean into his limits. So we see all the time in the scriptures that he took regular breaks from meeting with people and healing people and actively leading, just to go and sit by himself and be with God. We can see an example in Mark 1, verses 21 to 45. We also see Jesus not encouraging others to sort of overcome their limits and to minister to who's in front of them and where they're at. So a good example of this is in Mark 5, 18 to 20, when Jesus has healed the man who had a legion of demons in him. And this man, once being healed, says, Jesus, I want to go with you. But Jesus doesn't say, yay, come with me. He says, stay here and minister here where you are. That's what you need to do. He got him to lean into that limit. And finally, on the cross, we see that Jesus leant into a limit. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asked for this limit to be taken from him, but in the end he said, not my will, God, but your will. And in the end, Jesus went to the cross. He leant into a godly limit that in the end saw God's will done. And aren't we all so glad for the ramifications of that forgiveness for all? So life is full of limits. I'm about to read to you a list of some categories of limitations that we often face in life. And as I do, I'd love for you to listen, and I'd love for you to identify if there's one category that might really stick out to you and pull at your personal heartstrings. Perhaps it's a limit that you know you face and it makes you feel uncomfortable. Perhaps it's a limit that you know that you actively rally against, or maybe you've made peace with it, which is wonderful. But what the question I'd like you to ask yourself as I read out this list of limits is, what would it look like if I accepted the gift of this limit? And that word gift, it might be a hard word to really come to terms with. And I'd just like you to sit in that uncomfortable space if that's where you find yourself. So life is full of limits. Some of these limits can be the limit of caring for others. In different seasons, we all face different caring responsibilities in our families. Sometimes it's caring for someone who's unwell. Sometimes it's caring for someone who's elderly. Sometimes it's caring for people of different ages, babies, toddlers, and teenagers, and so on. We also face limits that are emotional and physical. So sometimes an emotional limit could be something that might be going on in our minds, or it could be something that we have been given because of the particular way that we've been brought up. Physical limits, I'm sure we're more familiar with. Sometimes we are unwell, or sometimes our bodies don't work quite as well as we would like them optimally to. We have social limits, right? It might be where we live. We'd love to live in the big city ministering to millions, but we're in a town of hundreds. It might be our social circle isn't as big as we'd like it to be. It might be that we've only really got 5 close friends. It might be that we're not as popular as we'd like to be, or the people who are currently around us, we might not think, oh, those aren't the people that, I really want to connect with ministry-wise. I don't know. It might be that there aren't as many people, or the kind of people in our churches are not quite the kind of people that we'd really like to minister to. But we've also got to ask ourselves this question about, what about growing the depth of the people who are in front of us and bringing out the gold in them rather than wishing them away? Another limit that God places on us is our human need for rest. In the world, we like to think that it's optional, rest. It's not. We need rest for a good 1/3 of our 24-hour period. And in that way, we're talking about sleep and good sleep, but we also just need rest from work, and we need leisure time, and we need time to connect with God, right? We also have the limit of our own personal giftings. Sometimes we'd really like to be the leader out the front on a Sunday. It's not as fun as it seems, actually, but we want that gifting, but it just might not be ours. Sometimes we really want to be more organized, and there are ways that we can work on that, but also that gifting might not just be ours. There are lots of giftings that we want, but we face this challenge of getting to know who God made us to be and leaning into that. A wonderful line by the preacher John Maxwell, but also a song that he's also written, has this line in it. It says, you've got to find yourself, to know yourself, to be yourself, to grow yourself, to get over yourself, to give yourself away. Getting to know ourselves and how God made us and the limits that he's placed in that is so important. So I've read out a whole list, and I'm not going to ask you to tell me if one of those limits really tug on your heartstrings, but I just want you to reflect if perhaps there was one. And I just want to say that if we don't recognize the gift of our God-given limits, that we can run the risk of not seeing the what and the who that God has really called you to. I'll say it again. If we don't stop and really recognize the gift of some of those limits in our life, then we run the risk of not seeing the what and the who that God has really called us to. We may end up having a ministry that looks like so many others, but it wasn't the one that God really wanted us to have. I'd love to quickly share 2 stories with you on this. So I am the location leader of Beyond Church in Scone, and something I wanted to run here from the very beginning was a youth group. And my conceptualization of a youth group was it's on Friday night, and you've got like 30, 40, 50 kids in a space, and you're ministering to them in that way that youth groups often do, playing big games and going for like an hour and a half and rah. And because that's the way I was conceptualizing youth group, I just kept saying, well, we can't do that yet, because I've got caring limits with my family, and I've got time limits, and we've got space limits here in Scone. So it's obviously not the time to run that yet, because we can't run that particular youth group. And so I just kept dismissing it. And about midway through last year, I just really felt this pull to be ministering to youth. And I kept thinking, well, we can't run that youth group, so we're just not going to do it. And then rather than leaning into the limit and thinking about, well, how can we do this differently based on the circumstances, I just kept dismissing it. And then I eventually got to thinking about the fact that I'm at a high school where I teach 2.5 days a week. And I might not run a youth group, but I could certainly run a lunch group with 20 kids at lunch. And thanks to the leadership of Luke in times past, when I was at a previous school where he was chaplain, he ran a group called Chips and Jesus. And so this year I started Chips and Jesus at Scone Grammar. And it's not a youth group, but it is ministering to youth, and it is within my limits. So at lunch once a week, I buy hot chips, we sit and we have a quick chat about Jesus, and we pray and we just talk about life. And it's been really good, and it's been successful in its own way. And I really am very sure that running that group is me doing the will of God, not by trying to reach people the way I wanted to, but by leaning into the limits he had given me. And I would have missed the who and the what that God was calling me to if I just kept doggedly trying to go with the what that I wanted to do, regardless of the God-given limits I was given. So Peter Scazzero goes on to talk about why it's important for us to lean into our limits as leaders. This is an all-in leadership lunch, and so I'd love to talk to you about what it means for us as leaders. And he says, I'm just going to say them very quickly, there are 4 ways to intentionally embed the gift of limits into our leadership as a church. We are a church, so I'm going to talk about it as a church, but you could also think about this in your own workplaces, or in something that's a little bit of a particular sector of the church, like Creative Academy, or it could be in a life group. So 4 important ways to intentionally embed the gift of limits into ourselves as a church. And the first one is to systemize the self-care of leaders. Now, what he means by this is that when we appoint somebody as a particular leader in the church, we're not just asking for particular character traits or particular organizational traits or particular, other giftings that person might have. He says that we should really be placing very clear boundaries and limits on what that person should and should not be doing in terms of their self-care. So one of the things that he says is that they make it very clear that they expect their leaders to pray certain prayers or spend certain amounts of time with God every day. And they expect all of their leaders to take a Sabbath. And they expect all of their leaders to leave a certain amount of margin in their calendars. And they expect all of their leaders to be actively creating their own prayer habits. And they expect all of their leaders to, and they put a whole bunch of other things in there. And I think, wow, I'm not sure if I would want to be so, micromanaging of a leader and how a leader is going to set limits on themselves. And then I think, well, if we don't, we can tend to run ourselves ragged. And so as leaders, we can actually be really clear about how we expect the leaders around us to set limits around themselves and lean into them. That's number 1, systemizing the self-care of leaders. Another thing is to set limits on invasive people. So this is really about being very clear, to be kind, and about conflict resolution, that as leaders, it is our job that if there's somebody who is constantly violating the limits of others by not respecting their Sabbaths or demanding too much from others, that it's our job to step in and have that conversation in a loving way that says, hey, this is what we expect as a church. And hey, we've had this issue that's come up and we need to deal with it. I don't know about you, but I don't love conflict. But as leaders, it's important that we are willing to set limits and have those conversations with people around us if they're not willing to. Number 3 is giving people the freedom to say no, right? Here at Beyond Church, we say that people are the leaders of their own lives, and that's really important. But we also have to acknowledge that we live in a culture where people are constantly encouraged to say yes to far too much. And so when we ask somebody to do a particular job for us or to jump on team, we have to be really clear about making the yes and the no something where both options are completely acceptable. Because if we're going to help people to lead their own lives, then we have to lead people to a place where they know that both a yes and a no are important, and to weigh those things well. And finally, and this is the one that we can all really start today, no matter where we are, whether we feel like we're leading teams or not, is that we need to model and teach healthy boundaries. And I'm going to sort of ignore that teaching bit just for now. I'm just talking about modeling healthy boundaries, because that's something we all have to be responsible for. Are we setting aside enough time to seek God? Are we having a healthy, deep Sabbath? Are we setting healthy limits with the people in our lives? Have we said yes to too much and need to start coming back with some no's? Are we present enough in our days that we can give our whole selves to those people in front of us? Or are we running around like a mad chook with our head cut off? Because that's what I have been most of the time, and I'm really trying to come back from that. So those 4 things: systemized self-care of leaders, setting limits on invasive people, giving people the freedom to say no, and model and teaching healthy boundaries. Those are the 4 things that Peter Scazzero says are really important if, as a church, we're going to lean into our limits. So I just got one question to discuss with you in the last few minutes, which is, what do you think it looks like to model healthy boundaries in your life right now? What do you think it looks like to model healthy boundaries in your life right now? We're all leaders, so the way we do this is important. So I'd love to hear from you if you have a thought on that or anything else. I don't mind. Go for it, Richie.
I wouldn't say I'm fantastic at this. It's something I'm learning. And I did read the Boundaries book by the American psychologist, Dr. Townsend, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, helped me a lot. But as far as Beyond Church goes, the leadership that is around me models this very, very well by going, I would love to, but I can't. I'm very busy today. Let's catch up another time. Just drawing very clear yes, no boundaries with why. I really, really like that. Here's your answer, and here's the reason why it's not happening today, or yes, it can, but it'll have to be later. So I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, and I love what you've just said there, Rich, about saying no, but also giving a why in a loving way, which does help to model, right? If we say, hey, I'm sorry, I can't catch up for a coffee this week, I can book you in next month. And it might seem like a long way away, but the reason I'm doing that is so that I have enough time to rest. And it's important to me to have a Sabbath. So if you want to have a coffee with me, we'll do it in a month. Like, I don't know, just being clear about the why can be such a great way to model too, which is wonderful. So yeah, we have had a really great modeling of that to us. And there's all sorts of other ways that we can also choose to lean into other limits that we have, not just time ones, but family ones or caring ones or emotional or physical ones. And we can trust that in the end, God's using all things for good as we really lean in and offer them to him. Hey? All right, well, thank you for coming to Chats with Beck today, All in Leadership Lunch. It was great to see you all, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. See you later.
See you guys. Bye.